Assalamu alaikum and a very good morning to all my very dear students. This is your English instructor Miss Kainat Kamal from English Department, Army Burnhall College for Girls, Abbottabad, and I welcome you all to the lecture 10 of Intermediate English class 2nd year. Dear students, in our previous lecture, we have started our unit 2 with the theme of hope and aspiration. And this unit contains 3 reading selections, but we have started the reading selection 2.1, that is a public speech by Martin Luther King Jr. And the title of the speech is I Have a Dream. In our previous lecture, we have discussed about the very theme of the significance of the title of the speech I Have a Dream. We did discuss about the author Martin Luther King Jr. and we also had a look on the historical background of the speech. And in today's lecture, we would critically analyze some of the dimensions of the very speech. As this speech was delivered on August 28, 1963 by Martin Luther King Jr., and he led a march on Washington, D.C. The speech he gave that day is one of the best known in American history. When people they remember the speech I Have a Dream as it has come to be known, they recall King's message about civil rights, because in this very speech King only talked about the rights of the Negroes. He only talked about the oppression of blacks. He only talked about the exploitation and the treatment by the whites towards the blacks. And perhaps the reason it is so memorable is because King was a master of literary and rhetorical devices. His word choice matched the strength of his message. So this speech is also important in a way that it is highly figurative. King, Dr. King, Martin Luther King, he used number of literary devices, figure of speeches in his speech, and this is very enriched in its meaning, in its body, and in its content. So before going into the readings of the chapter, I would like to make your mind clear about certain terminologies and about certain dimensions of the speech. So here are some of the important terms you should understand before going into the readings of the chapter. So the very first term, if you could see, that is written on the screen of your phone or your laptop, that is speech. So what this very word speech means? Speech is label, the faculty of uttering articulate sounds or words. Simply, speech is the ability to speak or to use vocalization to communicate. Now, what oratory is? Because the reason I am giving you the differences between these two words, oratory and speech, this speech is the best example of oration. This is basically the oratory by, not the speech, but is a type of oratory by Martin Luther King Jr. Basically, speech and debate is the part of oratory. Now, what oratory is? Oratory is the art of public speaking, especially in a formal, expressive, or forceful manner. Now, this speech is a public speech, and oratory is the art of public speaking. The difference between these two words, oratory and speech, is simply when you utter some sounds, you articulate some words or some sounds, when you have the ability to speak or to use your vocalization in order to communicate, that is speech. When you simply talk to somebody, that is a speech. But oratory is would be public speaking, when you would directly refer to public, when there would be expressions, there would be a formal setting, there would be a forceful manner of your the way you communicate with the people, that would be oratory. So this very speech by Martin Luther King Jr. is oratory, rather speech. Now, orator. Who is an orator? Orator is a person who delivers an oration, a public speaker, especially one with great eloquence. Now we can say that Martin Luther King was a great orator. Now, what is the difference between the rest two words, debate and speech? Debate is primarily a bidirectional communication where two opposing or clashing viewpoints of the topic being discussed are evaluated for their pros and cons, for their advantages and disadvantages. Now, debate is between two persons when they talk on two opposing different clashing viewpoints, but speech is more of a unidirectional communication where the speaker presents his views on the topic to the listening audience. So, one person involved in speaking is speech, and two person on opposing ideas on or on clashing viewpoints is a debate. I think now it's clear. So keep in mind that this speech is the best example of the oratory. It is a public speech. Martin Luther King Jr. is directly referring to 250,000 civil rights supporters, and this speech is basically famous for its forceful manner of expression, and yes, it is a formal setting too. Okay, number of rhetorical devices, or you can say stylistic devices or figurative literary devices Martin Luther King Jr. he has used in his speech. And first, you should know that what a rhetorical device or a persuasive device or a stylistic device is. So, simply, it is a technique that an author or a speaker uses to convey to the listener or reader a meaning with the goal of persuading them towards considering a topic from a perspective, using language designed to encourage or provoke an emotional display of a given perspective or action. So, when you say something in a simple and a plain language, that is that simply you said something. But when you add something into your language, you embellish your language, you wanted to decorate your language, what you do is you simply add rhetorical devices in your language in order to give your language an emotional touch, a persuading touch, in order to make your listener, in order to make your audience look into the perspective that you wanted to draw. Fine. So, rhetorical devices evoke an emotional response in the audience through use of language. Fine. So, simply with the use of language, when you persuade your audience, when you encourage them, when you evoke an emotional response into your audience through use of language, here you basically use a rhetorical device, a figure of speech, but that is not their primary purpose. Rather, by doing so, they seek to make a position or argument more compelling than it would otherwise be. So you should keep in your mind that the, like using rhetorical devices is not basically adding some emotional response by the audience. It is not the primary function of the author. Rather, the author wanted to make his or her argument, his or her position more compelling. I hope you are understanding what I wanted to say. Basically, the author wanted his language, it should be more compelling, it should be persuading, it should be emotional, like so that the message that an author, a speaker, he or she is conveying, it should directly hit the heart and the mind of the audience. Now, in this very speech, with reference to this speech only, the rhetorical device that Martin Luther King Jr. he has used, one of the devices I would say, that is anaphora. Now, anaphora is a Greek word, and it is a rhetorical device that consists of repeating a sequence of words at the beginning of neighboring clauses, thereby lending them emphasis. Now, what is the main purpose of using anaphora is to draw an emphasis on the very clause, sentence, or a phrase. Simply, if we go into the simple definition of an anaphora, so anaphora is it is a figure of speech in which words repeat at the beginning of successive clauses, phrases, or sentences in order to draw what emphasis. For example, in this speech, we would see that some of the phrases that Martin Luther King Jr. he has repeated. For example, 100 years later, in the second paragraph, then let the freedom ring, let the freedom ring. In the last paragraph, and free at last, that is at the last in the last line of this very speech. So there are number of examples of anaphora used in this. I have a dream, I have a dream. So inshallah, we would when we would go into the readings of the chapter, we would see. So before going into the details of the chapter, you should know some of the terminologies. So now I hope that anaphora, the concept of anaphora is clear in your mind. Okay, now moving towards the next term, and that is a figure of speech. What a figure of speech is. So simply, figure of speech is a word or phrase that possesses a separate meaning from its literal definition. Whatever has been written over here, that line, that phrase, that sentence, that clause, has some other meaning from whatever has been written in front of us. It can be a metaphor or a simile. These are basically the examples of figure of speech. Designed to make a comparison, it can be the repetition of alliteration or the exaggeration of hyperbole to provide a dramatic effect. So simply keep in your mind that figure of speech an author or a speaker uses in order to give its language a dramatic effect. Now there are basically this metaphor, simile, alliteration, hyperbole, these are basically the examples of figure of speech. So you should only know, because in this very speech, number of metaphors, number of similes, alliterations, hyperbole, these like number of figure of speeches used by Martin Luther King Jr. So you should know that what these are. So what is a metaphor? A metaphor is a figure of speech that describes an object or action in a way that is not literally true, but helps explain an idea or make a comparison. So simply, metaphor is a comparison, but is an indirect comparison. You do not use any word, for example, like, as, but when you use these words, it becomes an indirect comparison, it becomes a simile. So simply, metaphor is a direct comparisons to into two different things. Metaphors are a form of figurative language which refers to words or expressions that mean something different from their literal definition. In the case of metaphors, the literal interpretation would often be pretty silly. Acha, when poetically we call things something else, it is a metaphor. Now, here are some of the basics of metaphor. Metaphor states that one thing is another thing. It equates those two things not because they actually are the same, but for the sake of comparison or symbolism. Now, this is very important thing that you should keep in your mind, that for the sake of comparison or for the sake of symbolism, we use metaphor. If you take a metaphor literally, it would probably sound very strange to you. So whatever has been written to you, the poetic lines has been given to you, if you take them literally, it would definitely sound something strange to you, because things written mean something else. Metaphors are used in poetry, literature, and any time someone wants to add some color to their language. So when we talk simple and in plain language, that language is not that much effective. But when we want to add colors to our language, we use what? We use figure of speeches. So my dear girls, that was all for today. These are some of the terminologies that you should keep in your mind, that what a figure of speech is, what are metaphors, what are rhetorical devices. So inshallah, in our readings of the chapter, we would see into the details and analysis of these terminologies into the chapter. So that is all for today, and in advance, happy Eid to all of you, and inshallah see you in our next lecture. Thank you so much, so very much. Thank you girls. Allah Hafiz.